All right, so our next speaker is someone that you probably, if you know me, know that I greatly admire. If you don't know me, she's also someone that I report to at the Altimeter group. But it is with great pleasure and also a great honor to introduce Charlene Lee, principal and founding partner at the Altimeter group. Please welcome Charlene.
Thank you, Brian, and it's great to be here today. So I'm going to talk today about courage. It is not the topic that's in the program. So this being social media, we're going to change things up a little bit. And I chose to talk about this because it's brand new stuff that I've been working on. It's a post that I wrote recently. And because I wanted to talk about really what is really needed today in social media. There's so much technology. There's so many things going on. But what do we really need to take this industry to the next level? So when we think about the next level, I think many of you were doing this with me yesterday. We were watching this guy jump from 24 miles up. How many of you were watching this video yesterday? 8 million people watching it on YouTube. Only a couple million on Discovery Channel. And how many of you, just curiosity, heard about it in the middle of your day through social media and said, oh yeah, I got pretty much the same number of hands go up. Yeah, I saw a tweet from people like, oh yeah, this guy's gonna jump. And we had, my kids and I were watching this and we're like, he's gotta be crazy to be doing this. But then we had a discussion around, was he being brave to do this? Or was he being courageous? And that raises a really interesting question. What's the difference between being brave and courageous? Brave is when you know you're up against insurmountable odds, but you press forward regardless. Kind of the situation that many of us in this room are. Courageous, though, is something very different. Courageous is when you have absolutely no idea what's on the other edge, other side of that edge of that cliff, and yet you still take the jump. Now, the interesting thing about Felix, he's got the nickname of Fearless Felix, but he actually has a very, very deep-seated fear. He's actually claustrophobic. And so if you're claustrophobic and have to be sitting inside of a suit that restricts your movement, and you have to sit inside this capsule waiting for this momentous occasion, the hardest thing he had to do wasn't to jump out of the capsule, it was to get into it. Because he didn't know what was going to be on the other edge of that fear of his. So he had to be very courageous to step into that suit and step into that capsule. Now, the reason I tell you this story is that for many of us in this audience, this is social media, being in the digital space, is everyday occurrences. And yet, when you are an executive, if you are an organization facing this onslaught of uncertainty in your face, how do you feel about that? You're not feeling exactly very courageous. In fact, all you see on the other side is risk, tremendous risk, and uncertainty, and failure on the other side. So how do you actually do this? How do you actually convince this guy to take that flying leap, to walk up to the very edge of that precipice, and to take a leap onto the other side? They've got to trust you. Now, how do you build that trust? Oftentimes, we try lots of different things. We give lots of case examples. We also give them something like reverse mentoring. We pair them up with one of those millennials that you saw previously. Hopefully, they'll be able to get mentored, they'll figure out what it's like, sit there side by side, get tours of Twitter. Here's Facebook. Instead of looking over the shoulder of their teenagers, they're going to look over the shoulder of a millennial. That doesn't quite do it. So then we also give them lots of examples, lots of calculations. This is where the money is. And the fact of the matter is, it brings them all up to that edge. They look over the edge, and they still won't jump. They still won't jump. So what's it going to take? The thing that I've heard over and over again, and for those of you who have seen me talk about this, the only thing that I can absolutely convince these reluctant heroes, these reluctant, courageous acts, is to talk about relationships. Because business is based on relationships. It's a truism that they absolutely understand. And when you really break it down to it, relationships themselves are awfully scary because you don't know what's on the other side. And when they begin to realize that these are just relationships written in a very different way, but they can understand. They understand relationships. They understand how to manage the risk of that and what kind of courage it takes to open up that kind of relationship. So a couple ways to actually how to do this. The key way to develop that relationship is to develop trust, and not necessarily trust in the other person you have in the relationship, but trust in your support system around you, that if it does fail, if things go wrong, they will be there to catch you. So Felix was only able to jump out of that capsule because he knew the 300 people on his team were there to support him. All the months of preparation, the years that he spent, all the practice jumps allowed him to be able to get into that capsule, face his fear, all the psychologists helping him conquer that fear of claustrophobia. Now here in this case, what is it going to take to encourage those people in your organization to be able to take that leap? A couple things. I think the first one is to acknowledge, first of all, that it's really, really hard. It's really hard, and you have to provide the support and the encouragement. All you can do is take them up to that edge and hope that they can do it, take that leap. But also, if you say, look, it's just easy, it's simple, that doesn't resonate with them. They really don't understand. For them, it's extremely hard. So this is a classic story that I talked with the CMO of Best Buy. Back in 2008, Barry Judge was sitting down to write his first blog post, and he was extremely nervous. So he had his team, he had me standing by, kind of waiting for him to write his first post so I could comment on it. And this is what his first post actually looked like. It says this: the first post, here it is, the first post, he was glad that's over. You can literally see him stressing out at that keyboard. And he was really stressed. That first leap was absolutely terrifying. He went on to become a prolific blogger, and now he's very active on Twitter. And I have to say, even my own experience writing my first blog post was absolutely terrifying. I figured I'd throw it up here and so you could see. It was some 8 years ago. I've been doing this for a long time, but even now as I'm standing here thinking about the first time I wrote that post, my palms are sweaty. Remember back to that first time you stepped up to that edge and took that flying leap, how terrifying it was? Now imagine now when the stakes are even higher for somebody to go out there and take that first step, what it looks like. So I do believe that the second step is that sometimes people just won't go over that edge. And in the end, you have to convince them that it's not just necessary, but it's absolutely fundamental to their credibility as a leader and to your credibility as an organization, that if you do not do this, you will erode trust and you will not be able to move forward in the relationships that you need to have with your customers, partners, and employees. So here's an example of what happened. So how do you know if your company has credibility? I hope this doesn't happen to anybody, but this is what happened with Federal Express last Christmas. How many of you saw this video? Okay, monitor gets delivered to a house, security gate there. The delivery person takes that monitor and instead of waiting for the person to come to the door, chucks it over the fence. What do you think happens to the monitor? Destroyed. So FedEx sees that this video was actually captured by the security camera. The owner actually posts it up on video, and it's got 8.5 million views. What do you do if you're FedEx? You obviously call the owner, and you tell them, very sorry about this, replace the monitor, and then you have to deal with the uproar, the social media backlash that's happened. So they did something really smart. They went and actually put out a video as the head VP of customer experience and operations said, this is absolutely unacceptable. This is not something that we believe in. We've done all these things to try to make it right. But it wasn't quite perceived as authentic and sincere. The fact of the matter is that, the fact of the matter is that he actually didn't have that experience of doing this on an everyday basis. He didn't have that necessarily dialogue, and especially that relationship. FedEx didn't have that relationship on a daily basis. And a typical comment was, you know, when I get my packages misdelivered or destroyed, I don't get a video response. I don't get any response. So what kind of credibility does FedEx have in those kinds of situations? And I think in particular, it wasn't happening on an everyday basis. That relationship and that dialogue wasn't happening. And this is an example that I showed last year, but I just thought it was relevant to show again. This is what happened with Dell with their laptop blowing up in Osaka, Japan. And what do you do when a product like that happens? Again, credibility and trust wasn't necessarily there, and it was further eroded by that product malfunctioning. And so what Dell did is they went back to their core values and said, what can we do about this? Well, we have to be direct. And so they wrote a blog post simply saying flaming notebook. And they said, beyond what you've heard in the blogosphere, there's no update on the flaming notebook from Osaka. And they linked to that picture. which I still find to this day absolutely astounding. I mean, the fact of the matter is you rarely see this today. Even now, this was before Facebook, this was before Twitter. And Dell somehow found the ability to go into their depths, into their core values, and say, what kind of relationship do we want? Well, we want one that's built on authenticity and transparency and trust and credibility. We have no credibility if we do not go out there and address this in that authentic and transparent way. And yet here we are, 6 years later. And I asked this question last year, only a couple hands went up. How many of you today have organizations that can have this kind of conversation, would have the guts to put up a post like that? I would love to see the number of hands that go up. Okay, a few more hands this year, about double from last year, maybe 8 instead of 4. That's not great, you guys. We still have a long way to go. So that credibility has to come at some point. That courage to be able to have this kind of conversation, the kind of relationship that people expect, is absolutely essential. Here's one example, I think, from Four Seasons that does this, and I think in a very interesting way. What Four Seasons does is they put reviews in on their site. And they do it not only just from people on their own site, but they do it from all across the web. In this case, they take it from TripAdvisor. So they take all the TripAdvisor reviews of a particular property and pipe it right into their site, unfiltered. Now that takes guts. That takes tremendous courage because you have absolutely no idea what those reviews will be saying. But what does Four Seasons actually do? It builds credibility, it builds trust, because it says, we're going to give you the unvarnished point of view. We're going to make it easier for you to see what's happening at individual properties. And so this may not be as dramatic as a monitor being thrown over a fence or a laptop being blown up. It's everyday credibility that Four Seasons and that you as an organization need to build. The third area in terms of creating credibility, a couple other quick things. Again, make it an everyday activity. Make it the course of business for every single person in the organization, not just for the few people who are in charge of social media or in digital. And the last thing, again, is really go back to the core values of your organization, because that will be what drives that conversation, what drives that relationship with your customers. The third thing is create a culture of rewarding courageous acts. Now, what's a courageous act? The courageous act, I think, again, isn't necessarily just when somebody succeeds. It's also when they actually make the decision to take that risk. And so the key is to reward the risk-taking at the time the risk is being done. So when somebody comes up to the edge, reward them for coming up to the edge. Reward them for just even taking the very first step before they even know whether it's successful or if it's a failure. Because otherwise, this is what happens. People are terrified of this being on the front page of the newspaper, that whatever it is that they did was an epic failure. But they take that flying leap because they hope that this happens, this headline happens instead. That's a business success. When you take that risk, the true act of courage means that you have no idea what the outcome is going to be. And the key thing, I see so many people come up to the front of a room in front of their employees and say, go out there and take risks. And they walk off the stage and nothing has changed. The reward systems haven't changed. The recognition that somebody has stuck their neck out hasn't changed. None of that. And the key thing is, if you're sitting there saying, I just got told to take a risk, but what do I get? What happens if I fail? What happens if I succeed? What are the reward systems for that? And so the reward systems of recognitions have to change if you expect people to take that flying leap off of that cliff. Here's an example of that. The key way to do this, I think, isn't to acknowledge the big risks. It's to create opportunities for taking small risks every single day. In fact, what we find is that sharing is one of the most risky things that people can do. The simple act of sharing. If I share my ice cream cone, am I going to get it back? It's as simple as that. If I say something about how I feel about a particular area of passion of mine, am I going to be laughed at? If I say something personal or about the business, is it the right thing to do and wrong thing to do? Are people going to think that I'm silly? Will my credibility actually be hurt because I say something that isn't seen as authoritative? Every single time you take that little bit act of sharing, means you're extending yourself into that relationship and saying, is it going to be accepted on the other side? So if you can actually exercise greater opportunities for sharing inside your organization, even amongst a small group of people through an enterprise social network, or through, again, smaller private communities, to enable people to take those little risks, to create those little acts of courage, allows people to build the confidence to be able to do this. And in the end, I do believe that this executive who was glaring at you through those glasses will give you the thumbs up. Because over time, what happens is that courage comes with confidence. It comes from all those practices. Felix Baumgarten, Fearless Felix, didn't get up to 24 miles up in the sky overnight. It took him 5 years to get to that point, overcoming insurmountable challenges, not only technically, but also emotionally for him. And I think, again, if you think about the organizational changes that have to happen in order for courage to exist so that you can do the wonderful things that you're hearing about at this conference, all these exciting areas that you can take that relationship with customers, you won't be able to go there unless the courage inside your organization, the courage inside your leadership also exists. So this is my contact information. I do believe we have a few minutes for questions, but again, I didn't come all the way from California just to talk on the stage. Would love to be able to interact with you too as well. Thank you very much. So any quick questions at all from people? Go ahead. Okay, great. Thank you.
So I hear a lot of people talking, a lot of our speakers talking about their journey in taking their company to social, and it's a process, and some of them are, they're 18 months in. Is that typical of what you're seeing across B2B specifically, that it is a lengthy journey?
Yeah, the question is this is a lengthy journey where you're seeing, especially in B2B, 18 months. One of the things that Brian and I are actually working on right now is a research report about how people create these strategies. And we see them spanning out over years, not even months. And we are so keen on, I mean, how do you create a social business strategy that lasts for 3 years, right? I mean, we're trying to figure that out too, because the technology is constantly changing. But if you base it on those relationships and you realize organization change management, is a huge issue. I mean, this is not about technology change, it's organizational change. So yeah, I mean, I would actually build in the expectations, but there have to be markers along the way that say, we're going to move off of this pilot now. We can't be in pilot for longer than 3 months, for example. Anything longer than 3 months is not pilot anymore. It's just stagnation. So yeah, I mean, you have to build in a long time, but I mean, you hear about some of these organizations that are so advanced. They didn't get there overnight. Dell didn't train, 6,000 people now to go and interact with their customers overnight. They started 8 years ago. The question? All right.
Yeah, you talked about changing reward systems. I think that's critical. Can you provide any examples of companies that have ever actually done that?
Yeah, I was talking to a high-tech company, and one of the things they did was stand up there and talk about this. And then they started bringing up people. And they brought up failures, and they brought up successes too. And then they continued to do this through their enterprise social network. They say, hey, we're about to start on this project. But oftentimes you may announce a project, but if it was a failure, nobody ever talks about it. Instead, what they did is they talk about the reasons why that project failed. And I think Google probably is the best example of this. Fail fast and fail smarter is their mantra. They talk about every single failure as an opportunity to learn. Completely different mindset. They actually reward failure. They take engineers off of the failed projects and put them on the best projects, because whatever they learn is going to be so much more valuable to the people to succeed on next time. So they build on those failures. So I think about celebrating failures. In my book, Open Leadership, I have a book about the failure imperative. It is my favorite chapter, because you talk to great leaders, all of them talk about how important it is to be able to understand, address, and move on from failure, and actually celebrate it.
One of the things, Charlene, is for the audience that's watching on the stream, could you repeat that last question for them?
I'm sorry, the last question was, can you give an example of organizations who have actually put in systems for failure and rewarded failure?
I have a question for you, too, because I mean, you and I work together, we see this all the time, but what about the leader or the executive that actually doesn't believe that they have anything to be strong about? What if they actually believe that they're in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time? So what do you do in the case of stubbornness?
The stubborn, non-courageous leader. I think the biggest one is to say, you have to say, how do your actions here square with the values that you profess? And if one of the core values are, for example, being customer-centric, if it is about a new engagement with these relationships, you can think about all the different ways that them being stubborn actually don't match with their values. And it goes back to that credibility again. A leader hates being called by saying, you're saying this, but you're doing that. That erodes credibility, and every single leader is concerned about that. It will make them at least pause. Right. It may not get them to move, but it'll make them at least pause and think about it.
And I know we're going to take a couple more questions from the audience, but I have one last one for you too, and that is, for the people here, it's not necessarily just about leadership or senior management. I think it's the people here who need to know how to apply courage to go back here and to start to cause disruption from within.
Well, I think the hardest thing about the job that all of us are here is that it's really daunting and exhausting. And so sometimes it's very hard to feel courageous, especially when you're just constantly pushing against that wall, that wall of stubbornness. And so I think my key point is that the courage that you need, again, I talk about the support system and the trust systems, coming to an event like Pivot, finding the colleagues, and constantly rejuvenating that source for that courageous stance. Oftentimes, when you walk into the executive boardroom, you don't know what the other side is going to be. The answer could be again and again, no, or maybe, or someday. And that's worse than saying, absolutely go away, because that hope is still trying to raise eternal.
All right, so for the last few minutes, we have one more question you want to take, and then I'll be back.
Over here. Okay. Yeah, so the question is, you have these leaders who do a lot of talk but not a lot of actions. How do you get them to actually, instead of taking these little steps, to make that flying leap? In the end, you really have to make that case, the second point that I talked about. You can talk to them, they kind of get it, but if they will not take the leap, you have to put the pressure and create that burning platform for them. And sometimes it's competitive, sometimes it's a crisis, sometimes, oftentimes it's their peers getting them to talk to that. But in the end, the only reason they would jump is because they feel like they have no choice, because their position as a leader, their credibility as a leader is on the line. You have to make it that dramatic. There is, again, this is why there's no way to actually reinforce it other than to create that burning platform. In strategy, we will, on change management, we often talk about that burning platform. What is that burning platform going to be? And with every single person, it's different. And so that relationship that they have to build is absolutely with you as that change agent. Because they have to trust that if they're going to take that flying leap off that side, they're going to have you, they're going to have the organization. If they fail and fall flat on their face, that's how they're going to be able to survive that. And so it may absolutely be the small steps to bigger steps to bigger steps. But you see this in regulated industries all the time. You start with a tiny little grain of sand in a sandbox that they can play with, and then over time you have to grow it. If you're lucky enough to have a crisis, you may be able to move them faster, but that's under a tremendous amount of stress and duress. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.